Ever had that sinking feeling when an HOA busybody sets their sights on you? Magnify that by about 1,000, and you're getting close to what I experienced. It started with a petty complaint about my lakeside cabin, and ended with a 911 call, sirens, and a revelation that probably gave the HOA president palpitations for a week. She was about to find out that her little fiefdom, the Whispering Pines Lakefront Estates, was standing on shakier ground than she could ever imagine. Ground that, in a way, reported back to me. So, buckle up, buttercups, because this story is a doozy. Oh, and before we dive in, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, and tell me the most outrageous HOA demand you've ever encountered. I have a feeling this one might just take the crown. My family has owned land in this county for well over a century. Not in a flashy, look at my sprawling ranch kind of way, but more in the quiet, we own the forests that have been here since before this town was a town kind of way. My great-grandfather was a surveyor and a bit of a land romantic. He believed in stewardship, not exploitation. He bought vast tracts of timberland, watershed areas, and parcels that everyone else thought were worthless back then. Over the generations, some of it was sold, some donated for parks, but a significant portfolio remained, managed by a small family trust I now largely oversaw. The cabin, a rustic but sturdy log structure built by my grandfather on the shores of Serenity Lake, was my sanctuary. It predated the entire Whispering Pines development by a good 40 years. It was grandfathered in, exempt from their covenants, a fact that seemed to perpetually stick in the craw of their current HOA president, a woman named Agnes Periwinkle. Agnes was, to put it mildly, a character. She drove a gleaming, boat-sized white SUV, the kind that screams, "I have opinions and you will hear them." Her attire usually consisted of expensive athleisure wear that looked like it had never seen a bead of sweat, accessorized with an alarming amount of gold jewelry. Her silver-gray hair was sculpted into a helmet so rigid, a direct hit from a rogue frisbee wouldn't have displaced a single strand. Her reign over Whispering Pines was, by all accounts I'd casually heard from other, more timid long-term residents, absolute. She treated the HOA guidelines less as rules for community harmony, and more as commandments handed down from on high, with herself as the sole interpreter and enforcer. My first real taste of Agnes's particular brand of governance came on a crisp autumn afternoon. I was replacing a couple of weathered boards on the cabin's small porch, enjoying the scent of pine and the gentle lapping of the lake. Her SUV crunched to a halt on the gravel path that led past my property, a path, incidentally, that was an easement through my family's land to allow the Whispering Pines development access to a secondary road. "Excuse me," her voice, sharp and carrying, cut through the peaceful air. I straightened up, hammer in hand. "Are you aware?" she began, marching towards my property line, a clipboard clutched like a scepter, "that all exterior modifications require prior approval from the Architectural Review Committee?" I blinked. "I'm replacing 2 rotten boards, Agnes, with identical boards. It's called maintenance." She peered at the new, slightly lighter-colored pine planks. "The coloration is inconsistent with the existing aged patina. This constitutes a visual disruption." I swear, I could hear my grandfather chuckling from whatever celestial workshop he now occupied. "It's wood, Agnes. It will age, like everything else around here." She pursed her lips. "Furthermore, the noise. Construction activities are limited to weekdays, between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. It was Saturday, around 2 p.m. This isn't construction activity, Agnes. It's a man, a hammer, and 2 nails. And this cabin, as you well know, isn't technically part of Whispering Pines or subject to its bylaws regarding my own structures." Her eyes narrowed. "All properties accessing the lake via the Whispering Pines shoreline are expected to maintain a certain aesthetic standard. We wouldn't want to devalue the community, would we?" The implication was clear. My rustic, authentically aged cabin was an eyesore in her vision of a homogenized, perfectly manicured lakeside paradise. This wasn't about 2 porch boards. This was about control, and my little pocket of independence was a splinter under her manicured thumbnail. I just smiled. A slow, patient smile. The cabin has been here since 1952, Agnes. It's seen a lot of seasons. It'll be fine. I turned back to my work, tapping the nail home. I heard a huff, the crunch of gravel as she retreated, and the throaty roar of her SUV peeling away. That, I sensed, was just the opening volley in what was shaping up to be a very silly, very one-sided war. I didn't know then just how far she'd be willing to take it, or how satisfying it would eventually be to watch her meticulously constructed world of petty tyranny unravel. The lake, it seemed, wasn't big enough for both my peace and her pretensions, and I wasn't about to give up my peace. The next few weeks were a masterclass in passive-aggressive HOA harassment, or at least, attempts at it. Little notices started appearing, tucked into my cabin door or, bizarrely, sometimes left under the windshield wiper of my decidedly non-luxury pickup truck parked well within my property lines. One cited unapproved lakeside vegetation management when I'd pulled a few invasive weeds from my small patch of shoreline. Another mentioned improper refuse container placement, referring to my standard perfectly legal trash can, which was apparently not the HOA-approved shade of beige. Each notice was printed on heavy cardstock, embossed with the Whispering Pines logo, a stylized pine tree that looked suspiciously like a spear. I collected them, chuckling. They were so absurd, so clearly unenforceable against me, that they were almost comical. I imagined Agnes, late at night, poring over her rulebook with a highlighter and a vindictive gleam in her eye, searching for new and inventive ways to be a nuisance. The humor started to fade, though, when the registered letters began arriving at my primary residence, miles away. These were more formal, more threatening, citing escalating fines for non-compliance with rules that didn't apply to me. It was clear Agnes wasn't just a weekend warrior of neighborhood nagging. She was investing serious time and HOA resources into this personal vendetta. One particularly memorable letter claimed my old, perfectly functional fishing boat, pulled up on my own shore and covered with a tarp, was an abandoned vessel and violated some aesthetic code about nautical harmony. Nautical harmony? I didn't even know that was a thing. I started to suspect Agnes was just making rules up as she went along, or at least creatively reinterpreting existing ones, to an almost surreal degree. The other residents, from what little I gathered during my infrequent trips to the small local store, were mostly cowed. They'd whisper about Agnes's latest decree, the mandated height for bird feeders, the approved list of welcome mat slogans, the seasonal rotation schedule for lawn gnomes. It was suburban warfare, and Agnes was the five-star general of fussiness. My cabin, my little piece of ancestral legacy, was rapidly becoming the front line. And I was starting to realize that polite dismissal and quiet amusement weren't going to be enough. Agnes Periwinkle wasn't just an annoyance. She was a bully who had mistaken my patience for weakness. That was a miscalculation she was going to regret. It became evident that Agnes Periwinkle wasn't going to be deterred by logic, or the fact that my cabin was an island of pre-existing rights in her sea of regulations. The notices became more frequent, the language more strident. She was clearly frustrated by my polite but firm refusal to engage with her nonsense on her terms. I'd send back a brief, registered letter after each of hers, simply stating that my property was not subject to the Whispering Pines HOA covenants regarding its structures or private land use, referencing the original plot maps and county records that predated the HOA's existence. I even included copies of the relevant documents once, highlighted for her convenience. It was like reasoning with a poorly programmed robot stuck in a loop of its own flawed code. Her next move was to target my access to the lake itself. The cabin sat on a small promontory, with about 100 feet of direct lake frontage. The Whispering Pines common area, a manicured beach, and a rather ostentatious dock, was a few hundred yards further down the shoreline. One morning, I arrived to find a string of bright orange plastic buoys bobbing in the water, extending from the edge of the HOA common beach almost directly across my waterfront, effectively trying to fence off her section of the lake from mine. There was even a small, laminated sign attached to one buoy, visible from my porch. Whispering Pines residence only beyond this point. I had to laugh. Did she think she owned the water too? This was a public, navigable waterway, regulated by the state, not the Whispering Pines Architectural Review Committee. This escalation, however, prompted me to move beyond simply collecting her ludicrous notices. It was time to understand the full scope of Agnes's authority, or rather, her perceived authority, and the foundation upon which Whispering Pines itself was built. My family's records were extensive, meticulously kept by generations of fairly astute individuals. I spent a weekend in the dusty archives of my family's estate office, a place most of my cousins avoided, but which I found fascinating. It was a treasure trove of deeds, survey maps dating back to the late 1800s, correspondence with county officials over decades, and records of land sales and leases. And there, I found it. The Whispering Pines development had indeed been carved out of a larger parcel, sold by my grandfather's company in the early 1970s. The sale agreement was thick with covenants and restrictions, but they were primarily environmental, designed to protect the lake and the surrounding woodland. Things like septic system standards, tree removal limitations, and shoreline erosion controls. There were also carefully worded access easements, not just for the road Agnes used to harass me, but for utilities and, crucially, for traditional access to Serenity Lake by current and future owners of the retained northern shoreline parcels. That was my cabin's land, and a few other undeveloped plots my family still held. The HOA, formed later by the initial developers, had its own set of bylaws, but those were subservient to the master deed restrictions my grandfather had put in place. Agnes wasn't just violating the spirit of community, she was potentially breaching legally binding covenants that her entire HOA was subject to. I decided it was time to consult with someone more formally versed in current local ordinances and HOA law. I found a young, whip-smart lawyer in the nearby county seat, Sarah Chen. She was known for being thorough and for not backing down from entrenched local powers. When I laid out the history and showed her the documents, her eyes lit up. "This is fascinating," she said, poring over a faded survey map. "Your grandfather was very forward-thinking. These deed restrictions are ironclad. The HOA can make its own rules for its members, certainly, but they cannot supersede these foundational covenants, nor can they arbitrarily restrict your pre-existing rights." She confirmed my suspicion about the buoys. Lake sovereignty is a state matter. She has no authority to cordon off sections of a public lake. That's bordering on harassment, especially given the pattern you've described. We spent an afternoon strategizing. Sarah suggested a formal cease and desist letter to the HOA board, not just Agnes, outlining their breaches and demanding they rectify the situation regarding the buoys and the ongoing harassment. "But," she cautioned, "someone like Agnes Periwinkle doesn't strike me as the type to respond well to a letter from a lawyer. She might see it as a declaration of war." I grinned. "Sarah, I think she declared war a long time ago with a notice about the patina on my porch boards." While Sarah drafted the letter, I decided to do some more digging into Agnes's enablers, the HOA board. Who were these people who let her run roughshod over common sense and, apparently, legal agreements? A little quiet online research and a few discreet conversations with a disgruntled former Whispering Pines resident who had sold his place at a loss just to escape Agnes's reign painted a picture. The board consisted of 3 other members. 2 were elderly retirees who were reportedly terrified of Agnes and rubber, stamped anything she proposed. And the 3rd was a younger man, a weekend resident, who was rumored to be getting preferential treatment for his own questionable dock expansion in exchange for his unwavering loyalty. It was a classic case of a dysfunctional board enabling a petty tyrant. This wasn't just Agnes being Agnes. It was a systemic issue within the Whispering Pines HOA. My resolve hardened. This wasn't just about my cabin anymore. It was about the principle of the thing. Agnes and her compliant board were abusing their power, and it was affecting not just me, but likely everyone in that community who didn't toe her perfectly straight HOA-approved line. The buoy stayed up for another week. I'd paddle my kayak right through them each morning, offering a cheerful wave to anyone on the HOA beach who happened to be watching. Agnes would sometimes be there, glaring from behind oversized sunglasses, her face a mask of indignation. The battle lines were drawn, or rather, floated. And she had no idea how much ammunition I was quietly stockpiling. The family archives, it turned out, held more secrets than just old deeds. They held the keys to the entire landscape. Sarah Chen's cease and desist letter landed on the Whispering Pines HOA's registered address with a satisfying, metaphorical thud. It was a masterpiece of legal prose, polite yet utterly firm, detailing Agnes Periwinkle's campaign of harassment, the HOA's potential breach of the master deed covenants established by my grandfather, and the utter illegality of her attempt to cordon off a public waterway. It demanded the immediate removal of the offending buoys, a cessation of all baseless violation notices against my property, and a written assurance that such behavior would not continue. We gave them 14 days to comply. For about 3 days, there was a beautiful, almost eerie silence from the direction of Whispering Pines. The buoys, however, remained. I continued my daily kayak excursions, sometimes varying my route to paddle a slow, deliberate circle around Agnes's prized speedboat, moored at their ostentatious dock, always staying well within legal distances. Of course, I imagined her watching from her window, her blood pressure doing the tango. Then, the counteroffensive began, and it was even more unhinged than I'd anticipated. Agnes, it seemed, took the lawyer's letter not as a warning, but as a personal affront, a challenge to her sovereignty. Instead of compliance, she escalated. The next weekend, I arrived at the cabin to find a newly installed, rather flimsy-looking metal gate across the gravel access path, the easement path that ran through my family's larger, undeveloped woodland property to reach the main road. The gate was closed, secured with a shiny new padlock. A freshly printed, "No Trespassing, Private Property of Whispering Pines Lakefront Estate" sign was prominently displayed. I just stared. This woman had actually attempted to block my access to my own cabin, using a gate on land that wasn't even hers to control in that manner. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. I had a key to a different, older gate further up the main logging trail that also accessed my cabin property, a route I rarely used because it was rougher, but it meant I wasn't entirely blocked. However, this was a clear, unambiguous escalation. She was now actively, physically, trying to impede my lawful access. I took out my phone, documented the gate, the sign, the padlock, with copious photos and video, narrating the date, time, and location for the record. My grandfather, a man who valued clear boundaries and respected property rights above almost all else, would have had an apoplexy. The Whispering Pines HOA, via Agnes, responded to Sarah's letter with a masterpiece of bluster and denial. Drafted by what I could only assume was a cut-rate lawyer found at the bottom of a cereal box, it claimed my cabin was a persistent nuisance, that my unregulated activities threatened the serene character of their community, and that the original deed covenants were antiquated and open to reinterpretation in light of modern community standards. It was laughable, legally speaking, but it showed Agnes was digging in her heels. She also, through this letter, doubled down on her assertion that my use of the cabin constituted commercial activity because, and I quote, "The owner is frequently observed engaged in writing and contemplative activities, suggestive of professional authorship, which is not a permitted primary use in a residential recreational zone." I was a writer, yes. I'd published a few historical nonfiction books, a passion funded by my other responsibilities. The idea that sitting on my porch with a laptop or reading a book by the lake constituted a zoning violation was peak Agnes. She'd clearly seen me meeting Sarah at the cabin once or twice, discussing the case, and twisted that into conducting business. It was a level of intrusive paranoia that was almost impressive in its scope. I started feeling like I was in a slow-motion siege. Each weekend visit to the cabin brought a new, petty annoyance. One week, The small, unobtrusive wooden sign at the turnoff from the main road that simply read Private Drive, my family name cabin, was vandalized. The name painted over. Another time, I found lawn sprinklers from the edge of the HOA common area had been accidentally misdirected, soaking a cord of firewood I had stacked neatly by my shed. These were childish acts, impossible to definitively prove were Agnes's doing, but the pattern was undeniable. She was trying to make my life so unpleasant that I would simply give up and go away. She fundamentally misunderstood who she was dealing with. My family hadn't held on to this land for over a century by backing down from bullies. We did it by being patient, meticulous, and unyieldingly firm when it came to our rights and responsibilities. Each little provocation just strengthened my resolve and added another page to the growing file Sarah and I were compiling. The local sheriff's department, when I'd informally inquired about the gate on my access path, had been sympathetic, but said that without a court order clarifying the easement rights, which they saw as a civil matter, their hands were tied unless there was an immediate breach of peace. Agnes knew this, or had been advised of it. She was exploiting the gray areas, the slow turning of legal wheels. The pressure cooker was definitely on. Old Man Hemlock, a gnarly but kind year-round resident who lived just outside the Whispering Pines jurisdiction but had witnessed Agnes's antics for years, would often find an excuse to amble by when I was at the cabin. "She's a piece of work, that one," he'd say, shaking his head. "Thinks that fancy SUV gives her diplomatic immunity. Heard she told Marjorie Henderson her petunias were too flamboyant for the approved color palette last spring." He'd then give me a shrewd look. "But you ain't like the others she's pushed around. You got that quiet look about you, like a patient wolf. She thinks you're a sheep. Big mistake." I'd just smile and thank him for the moral support. He wasn't wrong. The contemplative activities Agnes so despised were indeed happening. I was thinking, planning, and researching. Sarah was preparing a more robust, legal filing, but I had a hunch that this situation was going to come to a head in a more dramatic fashion before the courts ever got deeply involved. Agnes was too volatile, too convinced of her own righteousness. She was like a tightly wound spring, and every move I made, every calm rebuttal, every refusal to be intimidated, was just winding her tighter. It was only a matter of time before she snapped. And I wanted to be absolutely ready when she did. The file grew thicker. The photos, the letters, the old deeds, the new surveys Sarah had commissioned to remark my exact, extensive, and very inconvenient, for Agnes, property lines. The air by the lake was getting heavy, not with an approaching storm, but with impending confrontation. The breaking point arrived on a glorious, sun-drenched Saturday in late summer. I'd decided to spend the day not at the cabin itself, but on an adjacent, undeveloped parcel of woodland that also belonged to the family trust. This particular piece of land ran along a ridge overlooking the lake, and, crucially, a significant portion of the Whispering Pines development, including Agnes Periwinkle's own meticulously landscaped property. My purpose was twofold. Firstly, I genuinely needed to assess some old-growth trees for potential storm damage, part of my stewardship duties. Secondly, I admit, there was a small, strategic part of me that knew my presence up there, clearly visible from below, might just be the spark that ignited Agnes's final, spectacular meltdown. I wasn't doing anything provocative, just walking the land, taking notes, occasionally using binoculars to inspect the upper canopy of the trees. I was well within my rights, on my own property. For several hours, nothing happened. I could see the usual weekend activity down in Whispering Pines, boats on the lake, people on the HOA beach. Then, around mid-afternoon, I saw it. The unmistakable gleaming white prow of Agnes's SUV, moving slowly along the private road below, then stopping. A figure emerged. Agnes, of course, a pair of binoculars, raised to her own eyes, pointing directly up at me. Even from this distance, I could almost feel the waves of indignation rolling off her. I gave a polite, distant wave. This apparently was akin to waving a red flag at a particularly enraged bull. Her reaction was faster than I anticipated. Instead of her usual pattern of stewing and then sending a passive-aggressive notice, she went direct. Within 20 minutes, I heard the unmistakable sound of an ATV laboring up the steep, overgrown fire trail that led towards my position. And sure enough, there was Agnes, bouncing along, her perfectly coiffed hair now slightly askew, her face a mask of fury. She skidded to a halt a few yards away, kicking up dust. "What in the Sam Hill do you think you're doing up here?" she shrieked, her voice echoing unnaturally in the quiet woods. "This is private property." I remained calm. "Indeed it is, Agnes. It's mine. Or rather, it belongs to my family's trust, which I manage." I gestured expansively. "Beautiful view, isn't it?" This seemed to enrage her further. "Don't you dare patronize me. You are trespassing. You are clearly spying on the residents of Whispering Pines. I've had complaints." I raised an eyebrow. "Complaints? From whom? The squirrels? I haven't seen another human soul up here all day apart from you now. And as for spying, I'm looking at trees, Agnes. Big, tall, decidedly non-human trees." She was practically vibrating with anger. "I know what you're up to. You're planning something. Some kind of development to ruin our peace and our property values. You and your contemplative activities." She jabbed a finger towards my notepad. It was then I realized she genuinely couldn't conceive of someone owning land without an immediate nefarious plan to exploit it in a way that would inconvenience her personally. The idea of simple stewardship, of quiet enjoyment, was utterly alien to her. "Agnes," I said, my voice deliberately mild, "this land has been in my family for over a century. We've taken care of it. We are not planning anything that concerns you or your HOA, other than ensuring our property rights are respected, which, frankly, you've made rather difficult." Her face purpled. "I am the president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. I have a duty to protect our community from people like you." And then she did it. She pulled out her phone, her thumb jabbing at the screen. "I am calling the sheriff. I am reporting a trespasser, a prowler, creating a public disturbance." I sighed. A genuine, weary sigh this time. "Agnes, that's really not a good idea. For you, I mean." She ignored me, her voice shrill as she spoke into the phone. "Yes, Sheriff's Department? I need to report a hostile individual trespassing on private property at Whispering Pines. He's up on the ridge, threatening residents. Yes, Agnes Periwinkle. Hurry." She snapped the phone shut, a triumphant, vindictive smirk on her face. "Now we'll see. Now we'll see who has the right to beware." The distant sound of sirens, faint at first, then growing steadily louder, began to drift up from the valley. This, I thought, was going to be an interesting afternoon. I had my own phone, and Sarah Chen was on speed dial. I also had a very comprehensive binder of documents in my truck, parked discreetly further down the fire trail, the kind of documents that tend to make self-important bullies go very, very quiet. The show, it seemed, was about to begin, and Agnes had just handed me the microphone, a spotlight, and a captive audience. She thought she was calling in the cavalry to run me off. She had no idea she was actually summoning the witnesses to her own spectacular undoing. The deputies arrived with a commendable swiftness, 2 sturdy, no-nonsense officers who looked like they'd rather be dealing with actual crime than a Saturday afternoon spat in the woods. Agnes was practically bouncing on the balls of her feet, ready to direct them to clap me in irons, I suppose. "There he is, officers," she declared, pointing at me as if I were a cornered desperado. "He refuses to leave. He's been up here for hours, intimidating everyone." The senior deputy, a man with a weathered face and calm eyes named Miller, approached me cautiously. "Afternoon, sir. Mind telling me what you're doing up here?" I gave him a polite nod. "Good afternoon, deputy. I'm inspecting my property, checking on some trees." I held up my notepad. "Routine maintenance assessment." Agnes scoffed loudly. "His property? Officers, this entire ridge is HOA common land. It's for the enjoyment of our residents, not for him to skulk around on." Deputy Miller looked from me to Agnes, then back to me. "Ma'am, Do you have documentation stating this specific parcel is HOA common land? Agnes puffed up. Of course, it's all part of Whispering Pines. It's in our bylaws, our plats. Actually, I interjected quietly, it's not. This particular parcel, Block 7, Lot A, of the old Henderson Survey, has been continuously held by the Northern Shoreline Trust since 1923. Whispering Pines development ends approximately half a mile south of here. I pulled a folded, laminated copy of the relevant section of the county plat map from my jacket pocket. It clearly showed the boundary lines, with my current location well within the trust's holdings. I handed it to Deputy Miller. He studied it for a moment, his partner looking over his shoulder. Agnes was sputtering. That's an old map. It's not accurate. Our HOA documents are the legal standard here. With all due respect, Mrs. Periwinkle, Deputy Miller said, his voice even, county plat maps, when properly recorded and certified, tend to hold a bit of weight. Sir, he turned to me, do you have identification? I provided my driver's license. He noted my name. And you are a representative of this Northern Shoreline Trust? I am the primary trustee, yes, I confirmed. It was at this point I decided to make a call. If you'll excuse me, officers, Mrs. Periwinkle, I believe my attorney should be part of this conversation, given the accusations of trespassing on my own land. I dialed Sarah Chen. She answered on the second ring. I quickly explained the situation, my location, and who was present. Stay calm. Don't say much more. I know exactly where that is. The full survey package is in my car. I'll call County Surveyor Thompson and see if he's available to clarify a few boundary lines. He owes me a favor. ETA, 20 minutes, maybe less. I hung up. My attorney is on her way. She's also hoping to bring Mr. Thompson from the county surveyor's office, just to help clear up any confusion about these old maps. Agnes's face, which had been a mask of smug anticipation, flickered with the first tiny shadow of doubt. The mention of the county surveyor seemed to give her pause. The deputies, to their credit, decided to simply maintain the peace until Sarah arrived. Deputy Miller said, "All right, folks, let's just take it easy. We'll wait for the lawyer and see if we can get this sorted out." Agnes, however, couldn't help herself. "This is outrageous. He's manipulating you. I demand you remove him from our land." The 20 minutes stretched, filled with Agnes's muttered imprecations and my own resolute silence. Then, two vehicles appeared. Sarah's sensible sedan, followed by a battered pickup truck with the official county seal on the door. Out stepped Sarah, all business in a crisp blazer despite the woodland setting, carrying a formidable-looking binder. And with her, a portly, white-haired gentleman in a flannel shirt, who was indeed Henry Thompson, the county surveyor, a man renowned for his encyclopedic knowledge of every nook, cranny, and disputed fence line in the entire county. Agnes looked like she'd swallowed a wasp. Sarah introduced herself and Mr. Thompson. "Deputy Miller, thank you for being here. Mrs. Periwinkle, my client," she gestured to me, "has been accused of trespassing. Perhaps Mr. Thompson can shed some light on the actual property boundaries in question." Henry Thompson, without much preamble, unrolled a large, detailed survey map on the hood of his truck. "Well now, Agnes," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle but firm, "this here ridge, all the way from the old creek bed clear to Serenity Point, that's always been part of the old Northern Shoreline holdings. Your Whispering Pines development, pretty as it is, stops way down yonder," he pointed. "The original deeds and master plan filed with the county in '72 are very clear. In fact," he tapped a section of the map, "a good portion of your HOA's common area, and even the access road are actually on land still owned by the trust, subject to specific easements. Easements your HOA appears to have been, let's say, rather liberally interpreting." Agnes stared at the map, then at Thompson, then at me, her face paling. That can't be right. We pay taxes on that common land. We maintain it." Sarah Chen stepped forward, opening her binder. "Mrs. Periwinkle, the tax situation is indeed complex. It appears the Whispering Pines HOA may have been voluntarily paying taxes on certain parcels they don't actually hold clear title to, possibly due to a misinterpretation of the original development agreements. As for maintenance, yes, you've maintained the easement access, as per the agreement. But an easement doesn't grant ownership or the right to restrict the landowner's own access or use, especially not on land they fully own that isn't even subject to your HOA's covenants. Like this ridge. She then produced copies of the original land sale documents from my grandfather's company to the developers of Whispering Pines, highlighting the retained parcels, the specific easements, and the covenants that the HOA was bound by. Covenants about environmental protection, not about the color of porch boards or nautical harmony. The smoking gun wasn't just one document. It was an entire arsenal of meticulously preserved, legally binding paperwork. Deputy Miller, who had been listening intently, finally looked at Agnes. Ma'am, it seems there's been a significant misunderstanding on your part as to the extent of your HOA's property and authority. Agnes was speechless, her jaw working silently. It was then that the younger deputy, who had been mostly quiet, muttered to his partner, just loud enough for me and probably Agnes to hear, "Holy smokes, Bill. This guy doesn't just own the ridge, with all these easements and old claims. He practically owns the whole damn approach to the lake. Heck, sounds like he owns half the county, and just lets people use it." Agnes's head snapped towards him, her eyes wide with a dawning, horrified comprehension. The hyperbole wasn't entirely accurate, of course, but in that moment, for Agnes Periwinkle, whose entire world was defined by the boundaries of Whispering Pines, it must have felt devastatingly true. The power she thought she wielded was built on a foundation of ignorance, over land she never truly controlled, against a man whose roots went deeper than her entire subdivision. Her 911 call had not brought her victory, but a very public, very thorough education in humility and the limits of her petty kingdom. The aftermath of that confrontation on the ridge was, for me, deeply satisfying. Though I tried not to show it too overtly, Agnes Periwinkle looked like a deflated balloon. The fight had gone out of her, replaced by a stunned, ashen disbelief. Mr. Thompson, the county surveyor, patiently walked her and the deputies through the key boundary markers on his official map, pointing out how the entire Whispering Pines development was essentially nestled within, and in some cases, overlaid upon, lands still controlled or with significant rights retained by my family's trust. The access road she'd tried to gate, an easement through our land. The common beach area she lorded over, bordered on 3 sides by our property, with our retained ancestral access rights to the lake, clearly documented as superior to any HOA rule. Even the land under a portion of her beloved community clubhouse, it turned out, was subject to a long-term lease from the trust, with clauses about community benefit that Agnes had conveniently ignored in her pursuit of autocratic rule. The deputies, now fully understanding the situation, were polite but firm with Agnes. Deputy Miller advised her that any further attempts to restrict my access to my properties or to harass me could result in actual legal charges against her personally and potentially the HOA. He suggested she consult with competent legal counsel regarding the HOA's true land rights and responsibilities. As they left, escorting a now very subdued Agnes back down the trail, Sarah Chen, Mr. Thompson, and I shared a look. "Well," said Mr. Thompson with a slight twinkle in his eye, "that was more excitement than I've had on a Saturday in years. Your grandfather was a smart man, son. Tied this all up neat as a bow." The repercussions for Agnes were swift and significant. News of the debacle on the ridge and the subsequent revelations about the HOA's tenuous grasp on some of its land spread like wildfire through Whispering Pines. The illusion of her omnipotence was shattered. The 2 elderly board members, emboldened by her public humiliation and armed with copies of the documents Sarah Chen discreetly provided to a few concerned residents, called an emergency HOA meeting. Faced with a roomful of suddenly vocal homeowners waving copies of deeds and easement agreements, Agnes's reign came to an abrupt end. She was voted out as president, and a new, interim board, was appointed with a mandate to conduct a full audit of the HOA's legal standing, finances, and past actions. I heard she put her house up for sale shortly thereafter, the gleaming white SUV disappearing from the Whispering Pines roads for good. The new board, thankfully, was composed of more reasonable individuals. They formally apologized to me in writing, removed the ridiculous buoys from the lake, and even sent a crew to dismantle the illegal gate on the access path. They also had their lawyers review all the covenants my grandfather had established, and began aligning their community rules with those more sensible, environmentally focused restrictions. My little cabin, once a pariah, was now simply left in peace. Beyond my personal vindication, there were broader positive changes. The new HOA board, realizing the extent of the trust's holdings and our long-term commitment to the area, approached me about collaborating on some initiatives. We worked together to improve the fire trail access for emergency vehicles, something that benefited everyone. I granted them a more formal but still revocable license for a small section of our land to be used as a children's play area, far from the lakefront, on the condition it remained open to all local children, not just Whispering Pines residents. The atmosphere in the community lightened considerably. People started talking to their neighbors again without fear of being reported for an unapproved wind chime. The approved color palette for petunias was quietly forgotten. Old Man Hemlock stopped by one afternoon, a grin splitting his weathered face. "Heard Agnes is selling fishing shacks in Arizona now," he chuckled. "Reckon you showed her that owning land means more than just a fancy sign at the entrance." He was right. It's about history, responsibility, and sometimes about patiently waiting for the overly officious to trip over their own hubris. The "owns the entire county" comment from the deputy, while an exaggeration, captured a certain truth. Influence isn't always about the loudest voice or the biggest gate. Sometimes it's about the deepest roots and the clearest understanding of the lines on a map. My lakeside cabin is peaceful again. The only sounds the lapping of water and the whisper of pines, just as my grandfather intended. And if you ever find yourself dealing with an HOA that's gotten too big for its britches, remember this story. Do your research, know your rights, and never, ever underestimate the power of a well-preserved plat map. Thanks for sticking with me through this wild ride. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had a satisfying, tables-turned moment like this one. Stay safe out there, and don't let the Karens get you down.